And now hear these words from the Gospel according to Mark. If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you have regained that one. But if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such one be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector. Truly, I tell you, what you bind on earth will be bound on heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly, I tell you, if 2 of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. May God add blessing and understanding to his holy word. It's a pleasure to be here this morning, and I do bring greetings to you on behalf of the Wisconsin Conference of United Church, where I'm still currently serving on that board of directors. And it's always a pleasure to be here and share in the good news of our national denomination, United Church of Christ. Whenever I'm invited to be a preacher at a congregation, I look to the lectionary text for that Sunday. When I say the lectionary, I refer to the Revised Common Lectionary used by most Protestant denominations, which over a 3-year cycle, you hear or read nearly all the verses in the Bible. Even the structure of the church does skip a few of those texts if you've ever read the Bible from cover to cover. Our sisters and brothers in the Roman Catholic and Episcopal churches have something similar, but they're not in sync with us. Before the text you just heard read in Exodus is the time when Moses sees the burning bush and was asked by God to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Actually, he's asked to go to Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go." And how did Moses respond? Why me? Have we ever had some kind of reaction like that when we're asked to do something? And it takes a lot of talking to get Moses to agree. Of course, the Pharaoh is not easily persuaded. His workforce is the slaves, the people of the Jewish tradition. In fact, Moses goes to the Pharaoh multiple times, threatening plagues, and a plague comes down, and the Pharaoh still doesn't listen, so it goes back and forth a few times. And finally, God talks to Moses again and says, you really got to go to Pharaoh and get this done, and the plague I'm going to bring on Egypt is the slaughter of the firstborn of each household. Pretty vicious, drastic measures. In this morning's reading of Exodus, we hear about the specific instructions about that process and how the Israelites will be protected. And Moses is to share these words with the flock. Take a lamb, unblemished and male, and on the 14th day of the month, slaughter it at twilight. Use the blood to mark the doorposts of the house of the members. Then eat the lamb with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, and anything that's not eaten by morning must be burned. So that night the Lord passes through the land of Egypt, striking down the firstborn of every household in Egypt. But the blood of the houses, on the door of the houses, is a sign that the Lord passes over that house and does not bring a plague upon the Israelites. This has become a day of remembrance to be celebrated throughout the generations. This is the beginning of the Passover feast. Thousands of years ago, with these instructions. Once the temple was built in Jerusalem, again, the first temple after the Israelites' return, it becomes a pilgrimage tradition to go to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And this tradition continues. The celebration of the Passover with the Seder meal is celebrated today throughout the Jewish families, but the form that's used today, it was probably not devised until after the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D. It is a sacred meal shared in multi-generational families with the focus on children with a very structured process. It is celebrated in the homes by laity, not by priests. Have any of you ever participated in a Seder meal? One or a few hands. Was it with a Jewish community, or was it a Christian-only event? Just church, okay. I've experienced it a couple of times, but only with Christians and only with adults and no children present. So it's not quite the same as the traditional Jewish situation. Hopefully, when you did it here, you included the children and followed the steps. The 14 traditional steps, which includes 4 cups of wine shared throughout the meal, vegetable dipped in salt water representing the tears from the time of slavery. Of course, matzah, the retelling of the story of Exodus from Jesus, the sharing of a meal, and blessings. I read that some modern adaptations are even being made in the Jewish tradition that incorporates references to more current things like the Holocaust. This beginning of the sacred meal is from the Hebrew Scriptures, which are part of our Christian heritage. It is the same God that we worship to that is the basis for this meal and the basis for our communion as Christians today. It was a time of the Passover when Jesus went to Jerusalem for his very last time. We read in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, about the meal Jesus had with his disciples and the sharing of the bread and the cup. You notice I only mentioned 3 Gospels. The Gospel of John does not refer to that last evening meal. As we know, there's no unanimity among the Scriptures and the Gospels. We as Christians take this Last Supper as the beginning of Holy Communion in the Christian tradition. But at the time of that first meal, and for some early years after that, there really was no Christian church. We were really just a subset of the Jewish faith. In those early years of church, there was a breaking of the bread done in the intimacy of house churches. We know that one way because of a letter Paul wrote to the 1 Corinthians, chastising them a bit for not having very much regard and structure to their communion services. In one case, it refers to them having a drunken party. 4 cups of wine at one sitting per person, maybe? But like any new and growing thing, the Christian tradition moved forward, grew from house churches to larger meeting spaces, and structure became part of that, and the priestly class claimed control of communion. And probably this was done by about the end of the 1st century, and then it became decided who was authorized to serve communion. Because in the house churches, everybody could. So End of the first century, structure comes along, things are settled, communion's fixed, and it'll never change. Well, it seemed that way more or less for 1,400 years. And during that time, there was only a single Christian church. And then Martin Luther and John Calvin and some folks came along, and we had the Reformation. A division of the single church that raised many issues and created many different thinkings and opinions about church and communion. This brings me back briefly to the text from Matthew and how members are asked to deal directly with each other, one-on-one in differences or in small groups. I think that might work well in a small local congregation, but it certainly didn't work in the wider church post-Reformation days, where differences continued to grow, different thinkings and understandings, and those things remain unreconciled to this day. Just the other day I read on the internet, so of course it's true, right? That there are 40,000 variations of Christianity in the world. I couldn't imagine a number that big. It was unclear if that was including all the local independent churches who have no affiliation with a wider church body. How wide and diverse has our Christian faith become over the last 500 years? Calvin and Luther disagreed about much, as I've referenced, even on the question of who can serve communion. Calvin was a lawyer. He wasn't even a priest. Wow, how do we get there? If we really are a priesthood of all believers, as we are called to be, cannot anyone who believes bless the elements? That question was predominantly settled at the end of the first century when the priestly class sort of put the structure in place and delineated who was authorized to bless the elements and serve communion. But it's still not totally settled in every community of the faith. So the questions keep popping up. Instead of getting closer and more settled in agreement, the differences exist. What happens when we consecrate the bread and the wine? Some Christians believe it becomes the literal body and blood of Christ, while many believe they are symbols that represent Christ's presence with us today. This is an issue I'm sure will live on forever. How often should communion be served? If you have any Catholic background or Catholic friends, you probably are aware that every day communion is served in the Catholic Church, which is the continuation today of the only church that was there for the first 1,500 years. For others denominations, communion is served every week. In the UCC, there are churches like yours where it's weekly, but in many where it is only once a month. When I was growing up, pre-UCC days, in an E&R church, communion was only offered a few times each year. So it was different to come as the times and I've moved to a different setting. What type of bread should be used? The text talked about unleavened bread. What I grew up with was those cardboard tasting wafers that could get stuck in the roof of your mouth. That was not fun. Is any bread okay? The variety of breads being used today in settings I've seen is almost endless. Is it to be wine or grapefruit juice? Local settings make their own choice about that. Denominational allegiance is almost disappeared. Just because you were raised a Methodist doesn't mean you won't be a Presbyterian or a UCC or whatever in the future. But when that happens, new people come to a new congregation. They come with a very different understanding of communion than what this new place they are in. At what age should children be allowed to take communion? In my growing up days, you had to be confirmed, which was always on Palm Sunday, and your first chance for communion was on Maundy Thursday. Now it's quite common for children younger to take communion, even in UCC churches. And it's a tradition in the Catholic Church for First Communion when a child is 7. The list goes on. In recent years, we have issues about communion and health issues. What about people with food allergies? So suddenly, just any bread won't work. It's dangerous for someone with a gluten issue. We're cognizant of people struggling with issues around alcohol, so wine may not be the solution. And not too long ago, when the flu was rampant, there was concerns about transmission of disease in communion services. Because in some churches, people literally sip from the lip of the same cup. Now the 21st century is here. And we need to adapt again. You're all familiar with technology. There's probably a whole bunch of you with little things called cell phones in your pocket here, smartphones. What about communion in our virtual world? There are faith communities who exist exclusively and only through the internet. What about communion in that environment? Communion is done usually in community, like this morning, with someone authorized to bless the elements. How can community be had when you're sitting in front of a computer screen, probably alone, physically, but maybe be connected with how many others scattered across states or around the world? This is a big topic of discussion in the world of church today, and the pros and the cons are debating this, and the debate has really just begun. Let me share some personal experiences I had in non-UCC worship settings with communion. First, my grandnephew's baptism was in a Missouri Synod Lutheran church. It was very clearly stated in the bulletin that unless the person at worship was a member of that congregation or another Missouri Synod congregation, you could not take communion. For me in the UCC, that felt odd and actually gave me sadness. Secondly, I was visiting a friend of mine who is an active member in an Evangelical Lutheran Church in America congregation in Washington, D.C. But for that Sunday, we chose to worship at the Metropolitan Community Church there. The Sunday we went, the sun was streaming in the windows. The place was packed. Not only the worship space, the whole narthex. They brought in chairs. There was organ and piano and bell choir, somebody signing for the hearing impaired. And so the energy was just bubbling over. The MCC serves communion every Sunday, and it does that by everyone coming forward, being served the elements, and then being prayed over individually. So communion can take a long time. But the most wonderful thing at the close of communion that morning, when everybody had returned to their seats, we stood, joined hands, and sang the Lord's Prayer. The power of the Spirit that morning was palpable. My third story was when a friend of mine who was a Roman Catholic had died. He knew that nearly all of his friends were not Catholic, but his faith said, I want the funeral mass. So he made a request, a very unusual request, and thanks to an extremely accommodating Catholic priest, we who attended were all invited to share in communion in a Catholic worship service. It was truly a wonderful moment. I doubt that any priest would risk doing that today in the Catholic Church. But it showed that we are all one with Christ, and it was wonderful. Has all this I've been telling you about got your head spinning? You say, I just want to partake in Holy Communion. In our tradition, it's a simple meal. The bread and the cup. Communion really is a very personal experience between each one of us individually and God. It is in that moment of taking communion that our greatest connection can be made with God. So here we are today in a UCC church in Dodgeville, in a denomination where only ordained clergy can serve communion, which is why, this morning at least, Reverend Green is with me. But if we really believe in the priesthood of all believers, then we can all partake. So as you will see in the bulletin, we are going to say the words of institution and the blessing and the elements in unison this morning. I've experienced that before and find it extremely moving. And back to the only verse in the gospel that really seems to connect with much of this is that last verse, for where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am among them. So this small community is sharing in sacrament this morning, fully in the presence of God. Let us welcome to the table all who believe, those with much faith, and those who wish for more. Amen.
The Joyful Noise collection this morning and next Sunday also is going to go to the Hodan Center.